All right, let me share my screen and get organized. All right, can you all see this? Is it coming through?
Yes. Yes.
This is our home on the right. We moved from the permaculture forest on the left to Coos Bay North Bend and brought our permaculture ideas to a new plot of land in 2020. While we downsized, we still intend to meet most of our needs for healthy fruit and vegetables, beauty, and renewal here in our gardens while caring for and rebuilding this small piece of earth. Scoof was one of the reasons we moved here. Another was the ability to live mindfully and in good health in this small community and in this landscape. Permaculture is a good fit in any community, anywhere, but we are finding it quite easy to practice the principles here. The term permaculture was first coined by Bill Mollison on the left and his student Dave Holmgren in the middle, with the release of their book Permaculture 1 in 1978. In Permaculture 1, Bill and David devise a framework for an alternative, sustainable agricultural system that is based on combining perennial trees, shrubs, herbs, fungi, and root systems in such a way that all elements support and benefit each other. As the framework mimics the function of our planet's natural ecosystems, it is meant to be an agricultural system that can be sustained indefinitely, a permanent agricultural system, a permaculture. In 1988, Bill Mollison released the Permaculture Designer Manual, pictured here on the right. This is the book I first took my lessons from, and the practice of permaculture started to take off worldwide. Mollison and Holmgren were by now offering permaculture design courses across the planet, and these proved a crucial factor in spreading the ideas of permaculture. By the way, many of them were free. As Bill Mollison was encouraging participants of his courses to become teachers themselves and design their own permacultural sites, the concept quickly spread across all continents, well, except perhaps Antarctica. Both, oops, okay. Other leaders emerged by the 1980s. Jeff Lawton, here on the left, works primarily in turning deserts into fertile agricultural sites. By the way, you may see some lettering come up. That's because I'm using um, uh, common photographs that I'm allowed to use, but I have to cite. So if you see some extra lettering, that's what that's all about. He has been involved, that is, Jeff Lawton has been involved with spearheading many successful projects in the Middle East and Africa of late. You've probably heard about Desert to Oasis. That's Jeff Lawton's work. Sepp Holzer in Germany actually practiced his permaculture techniques first without definition or principles, and he's now an accepted permaculturist. He is mostly known for the hugel and bearing wood to create berms, which I was actually doing before I knew about permaculture from his work. Both Holzer and Masanobu Fukuoka, who works in Japan, have practiced turning hillsides into richly producing farmlands with berms and swales, and their work is now accepted as permaculture. As permaculture leaders saw their smaller projects work, they realized the great potential in bringing more permaculturists into the fold. Anyone can use permacultural ethics and principles to benefit life on this planet as well as in their own life in their own backyard. The founders and leaders of permaculture have invested much time spreading the word in order to make a difference. It is the common language, ethics, and principles that make it possible for each of us to share our local tactics and strategies. And while these tactics and strategies are often what show up in our designs and are thus labeled permaculture, these are only the local results of the central ethics and principles. One of the wonderful things about this type of decentralized practice is that it empowers individuals and communities to work creatively and to take responsibility. The primary goal of permaculture is to make sure that what we do benefits our piece of earth without harming other parts of the earth. Earth care is a lofty goal indeed. The primary work we do is with our soil. The state of the soil is one of the best measures of the health of a society. The U.S. Dust Bowl, the disappearance of vast and rich societies, the blowing sands of the Sahara that changed the climate on our own East Coast, the debilitating poverty we see worldwide, each are linked to the loss of life in soils. The importance of good soil was known by the industrial age. Many, even our own Thomas Jefferson, noticed that the better the soil, the better all life is in any given area. But just how to keep soil from dying has eluded many civilizations for centuries. The first question is then, how do we know when a soil is healthy? The answer is amazingly simple. Measure the amount of life in the soil. This life is not just microscopic. We can see soil health with our own eyes. Probably my fondest memory as a gardening parent is the day one of my foster children, a boy who had grown up inside, being raised on TV, yelled out in glee, "No matter where I grab the dirt in this garden, it is all alive. It wiggles." Our earth should all over be filled with wiggles. That is a healthy earth. All life on our planet depends on soil, water, air, and weather. To practice earth care, we choose the best options possible to care for the soil, water, air, and life. All life. The beautiful heron, and even the slugs, and even the rats. Permaculture is also people care. We look after our friends and nearest family. If people's needs are met in compassionate and simple ways, the environment surrounding each of us will prosper. As our environment prospers, people prosper in mind, body, and spirit. We care about those family and friends who live far from us as well, in good times and bad. The ethics and principles of permaculture, though first developed for agriculture, have much to say about our interactions with each other. Our local community is better when we consider how our actions affect all who live close by and choose wisely. The actions we take, how we support those we meet during our days, and even those who we never meet but who live amongst us, are benefited as each of us care for ourselves and each other. Are our neighbors housed, clothed, fed, and safe? How can we help address these basic needs of our community members? It really does take a village. Recently, we mathematicians and physicists focused a great deal of our attention on the chaotic link known as the butterfly effect. A small action somewhere can create a large action somewhere else. Our small actions do matter, but as surprisingly as the butterfly effect is, it seems nothing compared to the disasters we are creating by our large group actions, pumping tons and tons more of carbon into our atmosphere each day. Our actions seem like nothing compared to the waste that a large group of humans dump into our soils, waterways, and directly into our oceans, even now. But our small actions do matter. What we do matters around the world. Permaculturists consider all people and all living things when we make choices. Fair share. We know this issue. Even in the U.S., with our entire lives spent so far in supposedly the wealthiest nation on the planet, we see those at the bottom are not getting a fair share even here. A permaculturist does not hoard and is looking for ways to feed, clothe, and house all. All life is important. How can I care about the wasp and not about the humans who are lost? One of the things that is really hard for those of us in capitalist states is setting limits when we can still afford to consume wastefully. It is necessary for each of us to set limits and redistribute surplus. We are responsible for guiding the energies, the money, the material, talents, and especially the food, housing, and health care that can be created with the wealth we have amassed. From the beginning of this permanent agriculture and into this day, permaculture remains a philosophy as opposed to a set of skills that can be honed by a tradesman. Permaculture is a philosophy of working with rather than against nature, of protracted and thoughtful observations rather than protracted and thoughtless labor, and a philosophy that finds value in the multiple functions of any living organism and the integration of many into a whole cooperative system whose sum supports each of the parts in a permanent circling of life. Out of this philosophy, three values gained primacy: care for the earth, care for all people, and fair share. These guide our practice. This makes permaculture different than science, different than organic farming, different than how people practiced farming millennia ago, and different than the agriculture practices of today that use technologies that lighten the labor but harm the earth. The worldwide permaculture community has an ethos based on these ethics. Most of our parents used many permaculture principles, and our grandparents had no choice but to use some of these principles if they were to simply live. Today we know more about our relationship to the soil, to air and water, and just how our actions fan out across the planet. We no longer believe that the earth will somehow simply absorb our waste. Today we cannot simply move to the next bit of soil after destroying the one in our corner of the planet. We must and we can do better, well, or else. The 12 permaculture principles are tools for the holistic thinking we do before we act. We look for patterns in nature and use these patterns to guide our choices. We learn just how to become responsible producers rather than mindless consumers. These principles are not a set of techniques or specific skills, but they are the framework we use when choosing the skills and techniques to learn and apply. Permaculture takes thought and practice. The first principle is observe and interact. This is the real science of permaculture, and I find it the most exciting principle. Watching and observing, noting my own interactions as I apply them, and watching my part of Earth take on more life. When do I plant? How much did the chilly spring affect this harvest? Are millipedes eating my red wigglers? Here is a dry part of my land. What will grow best here? Can I create turbulence here and slow the wind? The questions and experiments go on and on. I find a way to make a problem an asset, or what I thought was an asset morphs itself into a problem. No matter, I observe and interact always. I would like to share several stories, and 3 of them are about observing and interacting. The first is the prettiest. This is a muskmallow, a beautiful flower. This plant has several uses. It is a beautiful cut flower. All parts are edible, and I use both the leaves and flowers in salads and to garnish lots of other dishes. The leaves, when added to sauce, make a great thickener. I was so happy to discover this plant and find that it grows well here. But I knew nothing of this plant when I started trying to find taller plants to help shelter my young pear tree from a wind channel that I'm working on slowing. With all of its uses, it was a perfect plant to try. Along with the 10 or so other plants around this pear tree, this mallow is healthy, and the combination is bringing in beneficial insects as well as feeding us and supporting the health of this young tree. A most successful interaction. I'm not sure you can see the pear tree, but it's in here. There are even a few pears on it. I had read about millipedes that ate healthy root crops, but I had never seen them until I moved here. And there they are with a few other living things. It is only the youngest of these that attack the roots, it seems, at least when I look at them. But my first year here, all of my carrots, daikon, and beets were holy, and not in a good way. In fact, they were quite inedible. I thought at first that perhaps it was a nematode attacks, but I caught these culprits in the act. As an intervention, I simply decided that I would plant this year's root crops in a raised bed I'd never seen millipedes in. I had a choice of 7 of 8 of my beds. I tried 2. I was so pleased to see the daikons coming up clean. And I've harvested lots of carrots, beets, and daikons this year without seeing any nematode or millipede damage in those beds. I do use my own soil to help top off the beds, but I have been letting it sit for a year and watching for any sign of millipedes before adding it to my raised beds. We'll see. I hope I've solved it for good, but maybe they'll be back. There are a number of insects that mine leaves. One of the wonderful things about observing and interacting is that your skills do build. I have plenty of observations of leaf miners. Last year I was squishing the leaf miners I could see, but of course many got away. We still had a harvest of beets and even a good harvest of beet greens, but I knew from experience that I had a good chance of not having to work this hard this year, and I haven't had to squish leaf miners since mid-July because there it is. The wasps arrived, and they are busy eating these pests for me. This is a paper wasp, but so far I do not have any nests on the house. We are lucky to have lots of woods around for them to build in. It is great to watch the wasps on the hunt. The leaf miner, I'm going to see if I can do this without flipping a slide, is right here, just to the left and above the head of the wasp. You can see its segments underneath the leaf, I hope. And here the wasp is doing my work for me. I love that I am freed now to do other work. In fact, I took all of these pictures while I was doing some watering. I will still watch for damage, and if I have time, I will squish these larvae, but it's good to see nature showing up. Just so you can see here, oops, okay, well, it went away. That was a leaf miner. The second principle is catching and storing energy. We all know about conserving energy, oil, gas.
I guess she went away. You're muted, Charlotte.
There, now you should hear me.
I do.
And let me get back. I had to reboot twice, and this never happens, but of course it happens now. Okay. Oops, let me remember how to share screen. I think that's on, or no, I am sharing the screen, right?
Yeah, we see it.
There we go. Okay. So, let me find where I was at with tomatoes. So basically, if you look at these two tomato plants, the one on the left doesn't look as hardy as the one on the right. Can you see the difference? I'm going to keep experimenting with my volunteer tomatoes. I have never had so many volunteers as I have on this new to me piece of earth. Maybe I can aid the process this fall by leaving some fruit where I want a plant. What an energy saving that would be. Maybe I should also experiment with setting out the tomatoes a little later in the year. And of course, we all know about renewable energy. Building for passive heat gain and cooling, designing in a way that we need fewer energy inputs, and installing the most efficient and least wasteful energy sources available is all part of permaculture design. Just remember that your personal energy is just as important as the energy that heats your home and keeps the lights on. Learn to conserve. I've practiced several methods of composting over the years. In this temperate climate, trench composting and using these garden buckets are my favorite for energy waste that would attract rodents and flies if I put them in the big compost pile. They conserve my energy. The bucket method works best in the summer, but so I go to trenching in the winter. Compost is hugely important in creating soil. Ask me about it if you are interested. And the one we understand the most, obtaining a yield. Why work if you do not have a yield? In our climate, I have a yield in all seasons, greens especially, beans and peas. Many of the brassicas and root crops are getting easier to grow to a harvest here. I do not have tomato or squash and melon harvests that I had on hot summer days, but the garden gives us plenty of food. I need to note, though, that I might have more of a harvest and both a better and faster return if I used lots of fertilizer and other inputs, if I broke up my soil. But I would also not be building the life in my soil. Over time, I have seen yields increase in earlier gardens. I expect to see the same here. The harvest is not just the food. It is the beauty of the plants that are so sweet to the eye. Flowers that also produce food for insects and birds and that eventually return to the compost pile to help build our soil. I don't think a home is a home for me without CJ and an outdoor escape. When I was young, I simply hit the trail and headed into the closest woods. I did spend time with my mother in her garden too. There is something about being surrounded by all this activity and change right outside my door, both when I was young and now. There are always stumbling blocks and problems as we interact with the nature, and that's so much fun and and the successes, oh my goodness, a great yield. I was a gardener before I became a permaculturist. I often tried to force plants to grow that would take too many resources, too much of my time, too much water, too much fertilizer. They were not meant for the climate and environment I was living in. I still enjoy growing a wild diversity of plants and I experiment with their uses, but I now choose plants that work well for the area I live. Our Bay Area is in the Mediterranean climate zone. We have much to choose from, but notice these red areas on the map? Those are the places where their local plants will probably work for us. I also use plants that have been developed over the years by agronomists that do work well in our soil too. We have much to choose from, so while I do push boundaries, I do not go beyond the reasonable. For example, I grew a banana tree in a protected courtyard in my hot inland home, but I am choosing not to even try one here. Instead, I have 3 varieties of citrus that are doing quite well in a sunny spot in my garden once I figured out to use toilet paper rolls with that sticky stuff on them at the base of the trunk to keep the ants from farming scale on them. And when I find a valuable plant no longer fits my garden, I rehome it. I have had to work hard to get myself to compost extra plants that I cannot rehome. Perhaps there is a program for this. I love to grow celery. The photo on the right is healthy celery from my last garden. On the left is the diseased celery that I've grown for 2 years here in Coos Bay. I'm still thinking about what to do. I will not be growing my saved seed this next year, but will look for 2 or 3 varieties that provide some resistance to blights, viruses, and fungus. I will plant in different areas and space the celery much farther apart. I will also try interplanting and planting later in the season. I have much research to do here, but there is a chance that nothing will work. I am prepared to give up growing society, to apply some self-regulation and accept the feedback that I'm getting, if that indeed turns out to be the case. Thanks, Connie, for being such a connector. I was able to find enough bamboo to find enough bamboo to use it just where I needed it in the garden. We are lucky to live in a place where most of us can build soil and find other materials to use in our garden at low or no costs locally. A huge chip pile in my front yard was delivered for free by a tree service company. If interested, ask me about the uses of these. We can find renewable services and resources. The sixth principle is to produce no waste, and I have a huge caveat here. I am just building this garden, and I have a bit of waste, but not much, and I'm working hard to minimize it. It is my goal to get to zero by finding uses for any extra twine and small things that will come into my possession. Except for the metal panels, all wood in my raised beds is from either a torn out deck or some trees that needed to be thinned. Even some of the hardware is recycled from that deck. The decking was free. My handyman John and I split the cedar logs, and we paid only $8 for each 8 to 12-foot log. We threw nothing away. The bits of scrap wood that were not treated are in the beds, helping to form a hugel at the bottom of each bed. The sod was piled, sifted, and the dirt went back into the beds. We needed level walking surfaces in the yard for both CJ and I and our aging friends. I find that some of us can be quite a bit tipsy these days without even a drop of drink. The white rock that I do not like helps strengthen the base for the footings for our boardwalk, and the boardwalk itself and those footings were made of yet more of the torn out deck pieces. These were short ends. They did not go to the dump. When we trimmed the rhododendrons the first year, many of the limbs went to that on-street collection, and I'm not sure what the city of North Bend does with the wood they collect. Last spring, we built this arbor from this year's rhododendrons trimmings. It has really served its purpose in helping to develop some turbulence with the wind and as a support for beans and passion fruit vines. We can see on the right the sifting soil out of sod, or you can see on the right, is very slow. That really is a hand sifter. I really do lean over that garden cart and put sod on that's at least a year old and sift the dirt out of it. I have not had to replace soil, just clean the weeds out of that mess of sod and put it in new places. Boy, this looks a mess, and it was, but really it was the first take at looking at this property. When we first looked at the house, I drew the lay of the land using Google Earth. I noted the directions of the wind. Those are the red arrows there. And I noticed that the wind was higher than I wanted coming across this front yard. I also, too, found our survey, or our soil, a soil map, and found that we're on Bandon sandy loam, which is what they grow cranberries on and is a beautiful agricultural soil. Here's our backyard too. The orange crosses I'll talk to you about in a minute, but you can see I have the directions. The house has a south-facing roof that is good for solar. There were useful slopes when we looked at the property. The weeds in the back and the front lawn showed that herbicides had not been used, but I'm pretty sure that lots of pesticides had been sprayed. In fact, we found them in the garage. There was a great tree and shrub line on the north end of the property that would provide heat gain to the plants placed directly in front of this tall hedge of natives. We would not have shade issues in the backyard, just 12 feet from the end of the deck. A good people traffic flow could be easily attained in the front. There was enough work in the back, room in the back for the crops that we wanted to eat. We saw the patterns that we could use to create good people flow, nice edges, and the light and water reserves we needed for both growing food and raising soil. After looking at the big aspects, we zoomed in. So here in the front yard, we had rhododendrons growing way down into the yard. So we've cut those back so that the upper branches are still feeding the tree, and most of these lower branches were really not healthy. They were just trying to get some light. The south end of the front yard, I can put some gardens into to help break up the wind. I would need to fence the front yard to break up that same wind, contain our dogs, and give us some support for plantings that would face those heavy winds at times. I could eventually replace the unneeded third lane of the driveway that I've already pointed out here. And let's see, where am I at? Anyway, the compost. I had John set up this pallet compost pile the first year right at the edge of the deck. So when I'm in the upper part, the front yard, I can walk down the deck and just drop things right into the compost pile. This compost pile does not take kitchen scraps. It's just yard waste so that I do not attract rodents. When permaculturists plant plants and other things in the right place, relationships develop between them and they support each other. So the idea is to integrate rather than segregate. For example, our strawberries are along the deck where the snails and slugs cannot reach them, and they are easy for us to pick and water. Companion planting information is abundant. Most organic farmers use companion plantings. Many designers in permaculture think in terms of guilds of plants that go together. This is especially true when planting a forest garden. Integrating plants that support each other is such an interesting new topic that now that we know how fungal mycelia work. Ask me later. The corner of what will be the largest part of our forest garden had to be cleaned of ivy, blackberries, holly, and juniper trees. I planted with several species of native trees, shrubs, herbs, perennials, fruit-bearing trees, and even annuals and natives from other Mediterranean climates. All are drought tolerant. I noticed that they are being quite neighborly with each other at this time. I'll be watching and adapting this as needed. In front of these, to the south of them, are yet more fruit trees that will eventually benefit from the backdrop of this tall, dense forest planting on the north of them. Also, we have at least one feral cat who has integrated himself into our backyard design. I hope he is helping out a bit with the rats. Ask me what I do to make sure he does not defecate in the veggie beds. Integrated plantings are beautiful to my eyes. I find monocultures quite boring. As we've worked, we've used small and slow solutions. Our Permi design is far from finished. The work is slow, even on this very small plot, about 8,000 square feet, including the footprint of the house and deck. Most of the work is deliberate. You see a seafoam green wall on the left. That is part of the woodshed we took out. The painted studs were used in the building one of our greenhouses there on the right. The plywood I laid under the deck that we built here to help control the weeds. Honestly, it would have been cheaper to buy a new greenhouse and to have hauled all of it away to the dump. I had to pay our handyman John to do a lot of this work, in fact, the lion's share of it. But it wasn't lead paint, and we created very little waste in tearing down the shed, and John needed the job. Even if it would have been cheaper, the extra money went to a local fellow who is a good worker and needs the work. We have tried to design something to cover up the brass hanger and plug that was right in the middle of this rock wall that you see here. I am sure that it was for hanging a clock. By waiting and approaching the problem slowly, we were able to notice as we unpacked that we had a painting of a potto that looks like it was painted just for this spot. I find that slowly solving problems and keeping my investments small often does provide a bit of magic. You've seen that landscape or the compost pile here, but the top picture is the first year. I had John put together just one bit of the compost pile. I did not need 2 bins until this spring. Perhaps soon I will need and build a third. I have no need for a composting system that has unused bins and thus takes up too much space. Oops, let me go back. Have you heard or read the newest craze about eating at least 30 different plant products in a year, or in a week, excuse me? Apparently, this is associated with better health and with longevity. In the landscape, diversity minimizes the risk of complete failure. I grow 3 kinds of kale this summer, and I have 8 varieties of beans, 5 varieties of tomatoes, 6 varieties of squash and pumpkins, and I could keep going. Different plantings bring in different pollinators and predators. The more diversity, the less likely some one pest is going to take out too much of my yield. I build more edges than I need to have in my garden because edges are where so many good things happen. For instance, concrete and rock heat up soil and keep it drier. This is a perfect place for planting saffron, drought, and other drought-tolerant herbs. Even roses and pears are happy in that strip between the curb and the sidewalk, often called the kill strip by landscapers. Well, if you find the right mix for that kill strip, you can have a beautiful heat and drought-tolerant loving plant colony right between you and the street. Small spaces are difficult to plant can also be used to separate plants that can become invasive and cost you too much energy and weeding. I have planted mint along the west side of our house. This spot is separated from other plantings by at least a 3 feet wide covering on all sides. The mint roots are contained. I have less work. The fun of permaculture is to creatively use and respond to change. When the temperature rose and our inland house was impossible to cool in the summer, we could have purchased a far bigger air conditioning system, but instead we added an arbor on the west side of the house. This, with another arbor in the yard, produced over 150 pounds of grapes per year. We had goji berries and jasmine growing on trellises at ground level in the middle, and this gave us a quiet and cooler place to relax when it was especially nice in the evenings. When my arthritis made it hard for me to get up and down several times in an hour, and this was several years ago, I took to building raised beds. I am so enjoying finding solutions to the challenges that come my way on these different plots of earth. Part of the creative's response to climate change will necessarily include moving plantings to different locales. The flower here is a Madeleine poppy in the upper right corner. It grows over 6 feet tall, has flowers that can be over 10 inches wide, and was once found only in the Los Angeles basin. I wondered if it would grow in Grants Pass given climate change, and it did. It is spreading even more rapidly here than it did there. Planting this poppy was a trial that worked, but it might not have. Being creative means taking risks, and for people like me who like taking chances that we can lose, we really cannot lose because we can always compost the results. Permaculture is an excellent way to playfully face these inevitable changes. None of us is perfect at permaculture. Often I make trade-offs between principles. Using small and slow solutions mean that my yield is far less than what I was accustomed to when I moved and started bringing a new plot to life. Every move presents different growing conditions, and what I appreciate about permaculture the most is that I am getting better at practicing the thinking skills that help me find techniques and skills that are needed in new climates and landscapes. I do not start at ground zero when I move. I know how to analyze this little plot of earth that I have moved to. We who practice permaculture are not alone. I learn so much, not just from other permaculturists, but from other gardeners. Their experiences are just other observations that I consider as I make decisions on just how I will interact. I enjoy seeing the permaculture movement spreading. There are even permacultural communities in the U.S. If you are interested in joining a working permaculture co-housing project, I suggest watching a YouTube video of Kalish Eco Village in southeast Portland. This cooperative has an open house the first Saturday of every month. If you, like me, are a bit overwhelmed at this point, I very rarely even think about the 12 principles all in one sitting. I know that with practice, I find that my thinking really is very much guided by these principles as each becomes needed. Whoops. And I'm open for questions and discussion. Thank you.